I work a lot on Molyneux's question, and Locke spends some time talking about perceptual learning of vision, but very little about touch. And that's something that seems requisite for understanding Molyneux's question. So hence II.IV. I'm going to come at it in a new way. I think solidity can be acquired for Locke as a simple quale of common touch experience, common touch being a musculoskeletal feeling of total resistance of contact by an object between our hands. So air won't work, but if I place a cup between my hands, right, I can acquire the idea of solidity. And I think he says as much right at the beginning of II.IV. In some sense, it's an insurmountable experiential force that's hindering the approach of the parts of my body. And it's common enough to where it's an idea that we would naturally acquire just in our interaction with objects in the world. And Locke ends II.IV by essentially summing up his discourse by saying, put a soccer ball in between your two hands, and you'll just get this quala, this feeling of solidity, because you won't be able to touch your hands together. They'll be totally prevented from touching. If we don't have this way of acquiring the idea of solidity, he says, it's as if we're a person with blindness trying to understand color, right? So it seems like very, very simple, very straightforward. But there's these problem passages which suggests that maybe we can't directly touch solid objects. I mean, right after he talks about this common touch idea, he says, well, we can't actually notice solidity, but in masses of matter, if the mind having what's got this idea from these big bodies, traces it down, and we imagine it gets the idea in the corpuscles, right? The minutest particle of matter that can exist. And from that, we get the idea of solidity that he's after, namely the one that's inherent in body. Also, we have this passage where we're getting the idea of solidity not by touch, but by just seeing, observing a visual experiment. He talks about this experiment in Florence of a hollow globe filled with water that it's pressed on with screws, and you see the water kind of leaking out of the globe. And then he says, hey, you can get the idea of solidity that way. It's another problem passage. You can get it by thought alone, by a thought experiment. Imagine a drop of water, maybe in the very center of our Earth, and all of Earth is pressing in on it. It won't move out of the way. Why? It's solid. So most scholars take Locke to believe there's some kind of extrapolation from an initial tactile experience to like either insensible parts or some such thing. And Ayers calls it a kind of causality, right? So what's the cause of the feeling that I'm having right now? It must be a property of body that we would call solid. He says it can't be a simple qualia, right? He continues, we simply see and feel that there's something red, three-dimensional, resisting, and coherent, therefore relatively enduring in front of us. The recognition involves a sort of interpretation, though, right? You can't just get it by sensation. You need to have some kind of active role of the mind. I'm saying it's just something passive, right? You just get it just by touching objects in the right way. So here's a possible means by which we can extrapolate. We have to kind of step out of II.IV for a moment and look at ways in which Locke says we can get various ideas of things not by sense alone. So he says, take a grain of wheat. It's got these properties that are primary to it. And we can know the primary ones from the secondary ones by just dividing that grain of wheat again and again, maybe down to its chemical structure. And then finally its atomic structure. And we see, wow, there it is, the grain of wheat with all the primary qualities that we had when we saw it, right? And there's like that tracing pattern. Again, this isn't in 2.4. He does kind of make these like, in which I say in other parts of my essay, you know, in 2.4. So we're able to draw from outside of it to understand. Wilson takes the idea of solidity to be much more theoretical posit that actually like dovetails well with corpuscularianism. He even says that we might use something like Newton's Rule 3 in order to get the idea, which I think Mandelbaum calls it transdictive inference or transduction or something. And the idea there is that every body we touch, you know, like this cup again, is solid. And so we can just kind of make this, we can generalize from that. All bodies are solid. So extrapolation has some really good things going for it. You get to kind of like lay out your idea of perceptual judgment, whether that's kind of Ayer's like scaled down view or something more intellectual. It's a primary quality as well. You get a distinction of solidity and hardness, right? Hardness is something that you feel. Solidity is something that you kind of trace from the feeling of hardness that you get. It works for feelings of resistance besides these ones. So Locke says you just walk around and you'll feel solidity, right? You'll feel this support. And that's something that we can acquire if we use an extrapolation strategy. As I say, it works for seeing resistance and empirical experiments, thinking about resistance. It's an argument in support of corpuscularianism. And in fact, I mean, Locke right at the beginning says, I'm using this word solidity to kind of clarify what others have said about this property of body. Some say impenetrability. Newton says hardness and impenetrability in the same sentence when he's describing this same property of resisting. And if we think about that 2.8 passage of the splitting of the seed, we get a competition with Descartes' res extensa passage in Meditation 2. So it's a kind of pure mental scrutiny. And so you can imagine Locke saying, haha, Descartes, I can provide an argument where if you use that same pure mental scrutiny, you'll not just get extension, you also get solidity. But it doesn't work by touch alone, by direct touch alone. And again, from what we saw, this passage in 2.4 seems book-ended by mention of that. So what if we just start with touch alone, all right? And then see what we can get from there. I haven't read any scholars that pay attention to this idea of the common touch, the musculoskeletal feeling of being totally resisted. I don't know why that is, but it's right there. It's like this recipe for solidity. And what we don't want to just dispense with the extrapolation strategy. That's really useful, and it's presented in the text, but there's a lot of objects out there that we want to know are solid that we can't squeeze, right? So gases and liquids, again, we can't squeeze them. So we might have to use an empirical experiment, in which case we would use an extrapolation strategy to get the notion that this is a solid object. Same with teeny corpuscles. We have to trace out the cause in order to get the fact that those are in fact solid. And then large objects like the earth that we walk on, we couldn't squeeze that. And so what we might need to do is trace out the cause. Also, I think there's this cool response that Locke gets to have against Descartes. This is from Principles. It's this weird push argument. And essentially it says, boy, every time you try to touch an object, you essentially just push it out of its place. And if you're just pushing object out of your place, you're essentially defending a planum view, right? Where every time there's motion, you know, everything else has to move. So we don't get an idea of hardness, what Descartes calls hardness, but is actually solidity if you just do this this kind of pushing motion. And notice how Locke's response of just the squeezing passage totally provides an objection directly to this principle's argument. You also get a distinction between solidity and hardness. We get the idea of solidity when there's no contact of our feeling fingers or hands, and we get hardness when there is contact. So we can imagine Descartes sitting by the fire. He's about to go to bed, and he squeezes a just snuffed out candle right at the tip. So it's pretty warm. And if he does it quickly, right, he's able to say, oh, that's hard. But if he does it slowly or lower down on the candle, there'll be a point where his fingers are prevented from touching. Boom, he acquires the idea of solidity. So from essentially the same object in different conditions, we can get two different ideas, and that's all based on touch. So I think the common touch view does a lot of work that the extrapolation view was able to do. But the main move I make is to not dispense with extrapolation. Extrapolation is present in this common touch view, but it's an ancillary or secondary means of acquiring the idea of solidity that's for objects that we couldn't otherwise squeeze. I think we've got the bottom 2 points there. That's different. We don't have an argument for corpuscularianism in 2.4. We can square our idea of solidity with corpuscularianism using extrapolation, but really this is an argument that's, for empiricism, right? How, we get all these ideas from our senses, these primary ideas from our senses, simple ideas. And in doing so, we have this kind of flattened out picture, like, as McCann likes to talk about it, avoiding obscurantism. And we get this nice direct argument against Descartes' push argument from the principles. So I think there's a problem, though. And that's how I'm going to end. I just worry that any type of feeling-based idea of solidity is going to reduce to a secondary quality. Okay. It's going to be reduced to some kind of hardness or softness. We've got this passage here where hardness and softness themselves are reduced to something within the body. A hard body puts us to pain sooner than a soft body, right? So that'll come up in a moment here, but this is a general worry, and I think it's something that Mackey worried about, and he just reduced the idea of solidity from a primary quality, as Locke seems to suggest, to just a secondary quality. Why? He wants to make solidity something available as a common notion, right? Available for all of us, even for the children, right? Who wouldn't have a conception of corpuscularianism. And so I worry about this, though, because textually speaking, solidity has to be a primary quality. It's not something in us, but it's something out in the body. But there is this benefit to calling it a secondary quality, in that we know today that matter is not solid, right? Corpuscularianism is wrong. So this is a really charitable way to kind of get at 2.4. And it does so in a way that even physicists like Eddington, who talked about these two tables. One table is a bunch of like buzzing electrons supporting other buzzing electrons, like paper, a table supporting paper. But another one of these tables is this commonplace solid object that's comparatively permanent and substantial. And just that's the kind of thing that we get from this secondary quality of solidity, right? So let me kind of emphasize the problem a little bit more with respect to not just softness and hardness, but actual pain. So imagine Descartes with arthritis, right before bed, squeezing the candle. And even if he does the softest part that's still hot, there'll be severe pain that will prevent him from making contact with his fingers, right? And so here's my last slide. It seems like it's pain, right? Something in our body that's distinguishing between,